I'm Ariel Kroon.
And I'm Christina De La Rocha. Welcome to Season 3 of Solarpunk Presents,
the podcast introducing you to the people working today to create a future we'd like to live in.
Because
if Solarpunk as a genre of fiction dreams about the just and sustainable world we'd like to live in the future,
Solarpunk as a movement rolls up its sleeves and gets down to the business of bringing it about in the present. Welcome to Solarpunk Presents Season 3, Episode 6, in which Ariel talks to Dr. Jordan Kinder about petroturfing. By this, he means the establishment of fake grassroots support for oil extraction in Canada and the false portrayal of the fossil fuel industry in Canada as the underdog in need of protection. But before we continue, I'd like to interrupt myself to say, I hope you've been enjoying our podcasts. We put a lot of work into them to make them interesting for you, but we could use your support. Join our Patreon at www.patreon.com/solarpunkpresents for a few dollars a month for early access to episodes and bonus content. That would really help us out. Or recommend us to a friend. Or write us a review. All of that will help us grow our audience and keep creating great interviews and discussions for you to listen to. Thanks. And now for this week's episode.
Our guest this week is Jordan Kinder, postdoctoral fellow in environmental humanities at the Mahindra Humanities Center at Harvard University. Jordan and I were actually in grad school together, although I was a few years behind Jordan's cohort, but we worked together a few years back as research assistant on a project to do with energy transition, and I'm very glad to be catching up with him this episode. So Jordan, thank you so much for agreeing to talk with me today.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here and talk about my work.
So first, could you sort of introduce yourself, maybe say a bit about who you are and what you do and what you're interested in?
I work on kind of generally what's called the cultural politics of energy, media, infrastructure, and environment. This has led me to study a sort of variety of things, but in particular, what's called the pro-oil movement in Canada. And I've been looking at, over the past kind of 10 years or so, how this movement took shape over social media and used social media as a kind of way of legitimating itself as a popular movement of sorts. And so I just finished a book project on that that should come out in spring 2024. For maybe a little more about me too, I grew up in northern British Columbia in a town called Prince George. I worked at a gas station for like 5 years as a teenager that my dad managed. And I think this is a pretty instrumental moment in my life to kind of get perspectives on the ways that sort of oil undergirds sort of social life. Of course, I didn't really realize that was happening at the time, but looking back, that's very sort of important experiences for me to be able to approach these subjects with some kind of level of relationality rather than maybe like a cold academic distance that we're pretty often expected to have. I should probably also add I'm a citizen of the Métis Nation of Alberta, not sort of familially associated with Alberta, but my family's on that side is from southern Saskatchewan. But when I pursued sort of citizenship, I was in Alberta at the time. And that's how these sorts of distribution of Métis citizenship is sort of governed post, Section 35 agreements of the Constitution. So
I wanted to ask you a bit more about the book that you just finished working on like last week. I read is about energy imaginaries in the Canadian media. Could you give us an elevator pitch for the book or elaborate on that a bit?
I generally work on kind of energy imaginaries in Canada, and this book would be about a very sort of specific version of that. And that is the one that's sort of tied to pro-extraction and pro-oil views. The book itself is called Petroturfing, Refining Canadian Oil in the Age of Social Media. Mm-hmm. And that pithy title has the kind of keyword for the entire book in it, petroturfing, which is a sort of refiguration of the notion of astroturfing, which is a commonly, or sometimes I guess less commonly known form of advertising that took shape in the mid-20th century, where sort of corporations were creating front groups to create sort of perceived grassroots campaigns around things like smokers' rights or pro-resource extraction groups like Koch Industries, for example, major oil company, is documented for doing this sort of thing. I wanted to kind of come out with a different vocabulary for that to describe a phenomenon that happened and is sort of currently unfolding in Canada, which is a sort of handful of groups sort of trying to refigure our relationship to oil and Canadian oil in particular. And what their sort of bit is to suggest that Canadian oil is under threat by dominant progressive leftist interest groups and people. And second, that as a result, there needs to be a sort of grassroots movement in support of the Canadian oil industry. What's interesting to me in that is two things. One is that it's sort of creating these conditions to suggest that environmentalism or even indigenous activism is somehow wrapped up in kind of elite positioning that's separate from working class interests of any sort. And two, that the oil and gas industry isn't one of the most dominant industries in Canada. This is where the kind of artificiality language is coming out in that notion of petroturfing, which is that the entire premise of creating a grassroots movement to support something that's already dominant is a kind of false positioning in the first place. The book is tracking the emergence of this phenomenon, starting with a book called Ethical Oil that was written by the far-right media figure and former lawyer and lobbyist Ezra Levant, who listeners might be familiar with, particularly, I think, with his relationship to Rebel Media, which is a right-wing news organization. He's a co-founder of that. And so he wrote a book in 2010 called Ethical Oil that really kind of creates the case for the suggestion that Canadian oil is somehow more ethical than, say, oil produced in Saudi Arabia or what he understands as sort of conflict countries. Canada, as he says, is one of the few sort of liberal democracies that's producing oil at any scale like this. And so because of this, the oil produced in Canada is infused with these tendencies. And that's really where the kind of energy imaginaries angle and why somebody who does sort of media and cultural studies would be interested in this in the first place is there's a kind of cultural politics being generated around the substance itself in this framing. Attached to this book launch was a multimedia campaign that was sort of framed as a grassroots initiative. And this was 2011, so a bit before social media as we kind of understand it today was really understood to be social media. Platforms were less integrated. We did have YouTube, we did have Twitter, we did have Facebook, but they weren't sort of really collectively understood as social media as such. This ethical oil organization was using these platforms to circulate these narratives that are in the book. There was kind of a formal apparatus of this organization. It had a director, a few of them over the years that it was active. A couple of years into this, more groups sprung up. And so I have about 5 or 6 that I look at throughout the book and track them from sort of like when ethical oil started, 2010 and 11, up to 2020. And I was mainly really interested in ethical oil as a kind of extreme case of greenwashing. But the more I followed it, more groups came out and actually some sort of traction of these narratives took place. So you would see in CBC or other news media that attempt to kind of have a balanced view of issues. They would include the voices from some of these organizations alongside Indigenous protesters or environmentalist protesters. And so you could kind of see these groups sort of influencing the larger discussion in a way. And that's only sort of become more prominent into the present. And that's sort of how the book tracks this and specifically looks at what kinds of energy imaginaries are being supported and generated. And those are generally attaching positive social, economic, and ecological aspects to Canadian oil. And so the book really tracks the way that those kind of 3 domains are circulated and supported through memes and other kinds of social media posts.
So as I understand it, sort of the energy imaginary would be sort of made up of all of these narratives that are telling us what to think, basically, about the way that oil and gas is sort of represented in Canada.
Exactly. And so it is to say that there's really sort of explicit narratives being attached to Canadian oil as a substance and also then its infrastructures. So in the book, it's mainly around pipelines because the sort of past decade has been many sort of disputes over a handful of major pipelines. none of which seem to be moving forward aside from one, the Trans Mountain expansion. But I really look at four that keep kind of propping up, and that's the Trans Mountain expansion pipeline, the Northern Gateway pipeline, Keystone XL, and the Energy East. And so most of those are canceled as far as pipelines can be canceled, but the Trans Mountain expansion is still moving with full force. And so the suggestion in the book is that because there's this discrepancy between the way that these groups are suggesting that the oil and gas industry is some kind of underdog force, despite the fact that production in the oil sands has only ever increased, aside from a little blip in 2019 or so. Basically, every year is a record-breaking year. This sort of premise of marginalization is a fiction, but it's powerful given the kinds of more pronounced kind of public debates that are happening about transition and just transition and so on. And so one of the claims that I make in the book is that while production is consistently going up, these groups are really trying to kind of saturate the media environment so that if any policies come in that actually do threaten production with any sort of serious potentiality, there's a kind of storehouse of energy imaginaries to draw upon that are already sort of in the public sphere.
So, and then the media becomes a sort of repository for all of these different narratives that can be brought out whenever there is a need for it, I guess.
And you do see that need coming up. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, for example, is a good example of this happening, because one of the first things that was sort of discussed in Canadian media, and particularly a piece in the Globe and Mail, was an op-ed titled "The World Needs More Canadian Oil." And another sort of point is one of the first set of tweets that then the Premier of Alberta, Jason Kenney, put out in response to the invasion and war was that we need to put sanctions on Russia and we need to increase Canadian oil. So he was saying that as he was offering his kind of condolences and concern for the war, but all in the sort of same breath. That's the case when these kinds of narratives about social license just suddenly become necessary to bring out and easily brought out. And so in that whole discussion, there was a conversation about reviving the Energy East pipeline, for example. That's sort of seriously on the table of discussion in the context of increasing Canadian oil on the world market, but in particular to Europe, and that because that would end up being sort of shipped out of the eastern coast. That's an example of how this kind of storehouse could operate.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, especially given that this whole idea of ethical oil seems to be sourced in the values of liberal democracy. And then if you've got, say the war in Ukraine, and you've got Russia as the fascist boogeyman. And so that oil is not ethical, as opposed to the ethicality, quote unquote, of Canadian oil. Never mind all of the land destruction that's happening because of it.
This is it. Once you poke a bit at the actual kind of premises of the ethical oil argument, it falls apart relatively quickly. But there's powerful elements to it that I think shouldn't be taken for granted. When I started doing this work, actually, I think quite a few other sort of academics and people in circles that I was in, especially when you're sort of a junior scholar finding your way, seemed to think that it was a sort of not a worthwhile endeavor to be spending a lot of time reading a book like Ethical Oil, because it's sort of an easy target to pick at in terms of whatever argument it's making. But the reality is what I'm doing in this book isn't picking apart the arguments themselves, but rather looking at the core of it and seeing what is powerful about that, and what kinds of energy imaginaries are being constructed and circulated through this, not to simply debate the merits of the ethical oil argument, but rather to think seriously about the power that these arguments might have in shaping, like a collective energy imaginary, which they seem to be doing in a way that I don't think people expected who were aware of this phenomenon before it really gained steam.
That resonates with me a lot, actually. Like, as a junior scholar who was studying, science fiction, it was like, well, these books might not be great. They're, like popular for a reason. This ethical oil book got really popular for a reason. What is it that draws people to those kinds of narratives? And what do these narratives do that may be a narrative that, like, hey, Canadian oil is actively destroying the environment and trampling all over, people's rights and stuff like that. Like, what is it about that narrative full of facts that is not quite having as much traction as the, ethical oil narrative?
The reason ethical oil started was as a response to the dirty oil campaigns that were occurring in like the mid 2000s and were pretty effective. So Greenpeace and many other organizations were behind this, which it was drawing attention to the realities of oil sands production, which is that it uses vast amounts of resources and inputs to be upgraded into what can resemble conventional oil. On the flip side, it produces these waste byproducts that we don't know how to treat, and those turn into tailings ponds. And so between those two things, the oil sands are considered to be one of the most polluting industrial projects on the planet. And so that's what these groups were drawing attention to with the kind of moniker of dirty oil. That's an energy imaginary too, right? It's doing a similar structural move as ethical oil ends up doing. And so you end up in this conflictual zone that in the book I call oil culture wars, because these groups, as I don't think I mentioned earlier, are sort of wrapped up in the right-wing media ecosystem, as sort of even its origins with a figure like Ezra Levant show. It's a kind of culture war that's occurring. Facts and sort of energy imaginaries are battling it out to see which one reigns supreme. And one of the points I make in the book is that I think that that's kind of a losing battle. The dirty oil argument might not have been the best strategy to go with in the first place, in that it kind of breeds the possibility for this defensive position around ethics.
Right.
So whether everyone will agree with me on that, we'll see. My peer reviewers had a bit of pushback against some of that in the sense that it might be construed as taking the sort of petroturfing project at its word in terms of its own origins and kind of reifying its conditions. But I don't really think that's quite the case. And I do think that some massive NGOs like Greenpeace deserve some criticism in some capacity for potentially sort of short-sighted ways of generating energy imaginaries like that. If Canadian oil is particularly dirty oil, that means we might have clean oil somewhere else. The kind of this whole set of signifiers comes into play here that are implicated in calling Canadian oil specifically dirty.
I'm fascinated by the fact that this ethical oil campaign, it's not talking at all about the environment. It's not talking at all about all these other issues that the dirty oil campaign was calling out, because it's focusing specifically, it seems like to me that it's focusing specifically on these sort of like political values. And that is within the realm of ethics, whereas the environment falls outside of the realm of ethics.
I think that is the kind of fundamental premise of it, is a kind of really specific version of ethics being deployed. But I will say that it selectively raises issues around the environment insofar as it points to the kind of regulatory apparatus that exists in Canada as a good example of environmentally responsibly extracting oil when compared again to these sort of conflict zones or conflict oil producers. And this is done by gesturing to reclamation projects and the necessity for oil companies to sign leases that say they'll return the land back to the state in the same condition that they got it in, which is essentially the reclamation clause. They haven't really done that. There's one example of that called Gateway Hill. It represents something like 0.1% of all affected land, and that percentage is probably even a little smaller now compared to the last time I looked at that statistic. But it points to that, and then it also then just points to the general environmental regulation apparatus as having enough checks and balances to consider the oil to be produced in a more environmentally sound way than places that might not have those regulatory apparatuses. Of course, on the flip side, a lot of the other groups that I'm looking at throughout the book are quick to criticize the sort of liberal establishment, to criticize environmental regulations to a certain capacity, So it does two things for them. It allows them to have a target to critique, but then also allows them to have a premise to circulate this whole position on. It does the same thing in relation to gender politics. In fact, gender was really the kind of first entry point of the ethical oil campaign, as it compared the way that women are treated in the West versus the way that women are treated in Middle Eastern countries specifically. They had an advertisement that they aired on the Oprah Winfrey Network in Canada comparing the way that women are treated in Canada versus Sudan, I think, was specifically the country that was called out in the advertisement. But that was kind of one of the first premises in which this narrative was being circulated.
Interesting.
Yeah, the book is kind of mapping these registers in which these narratives come out, and particularly looking at the conditions of social media that allow for the kind of self-presentation of a grassroots positioning where that may not be the truth. The deployment of the term astroturfing in general usually refers to groups that have been, their financing has been shown to be directly related to industry or a company. And it's not the case that I know this about the groups that I'm looking at. And so that's also why I sort of position this new term of petroturfing, is to think less about where the funding is coming from, but more about how dominant industry narratives are repackaged to be marginal and underdog positioning and sort of countercultural in a way, to frame sort of like a certain kind of liberal environmentalism as the dominant view in a way that doesn't really pan out. And so this kind of fiction is really the basis for that vocabulary. I will say one of the groups I looked at, some investigative journalists have found payments from oil and gas companies to them, but there's not really enough evidence for me to make that claim with any certainty.
Okay.
Lest I get charged with libel or something like that. I don't know.
Right.
They would have to prove that they don't, which would be an interesting position to be in, actually. So I will say the main groups that I'm looking at, there's a few of them. So one is called Canada Action, and it was started by a real estate agent in Calgary.
Mm-hmm.
Ethical Oil obviously was related to Ezra Levant, but was sort of started as a splinter multimedia campaign from that. There's another one called Oil Sands Strong, and that was started by a guy who runs an advertising company in Fort McMurray, who clearly has contracts from oil and gas companies at some point in his portfolio and other businesses around Fort McMurray, and is deeply invested in the oil industry, as would be somebody working in real estate in Calgary, right? So
Right.
There may not be these immediate connections to, getting paid by Suncor or something like that, but there's a deep sort of personal financial investment in the state of a prospering fossil economy in Alberta. And then a couple of the others that I look at are actually ones tied to lobbying groups that are sort of their grassroots branch. One called Oil Respect, and another one called Canada's Energy Citizens, which is a Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers campaign. The last one I recall off the top of my head that I look at is one from British Columbia called British Columbians for International Prosperity or something like that. And they pulled all their content from the internet since 2017, but were active around that same time as Ethical Oil, in particular when the Northern Gateway pipeline was being sort of most aggressively pursued before it was canceled. And that group was ran by a former oil and gas manager and lobbyist or something like that, very direct connection. So very tenuous claims about a distance from industry that are sort of easy to poke at and see where the kind of vested interests in supporting this industry are. And as a sort of final point to this part of our conversation, I think it is important to keep saying it's about supporting the industry. Every now and then, the workers themselves will show up in the way that those gestures work, but it is really more concerned about the abstract kind of character of the industry rather than actually the people who are working in it. That bifurcation is really important to identify, because the cultural work that these groups are doing is by sort of aligning or creating an alignment between the industry interests and the workers' interests, which aren't always the same, but it's sort of collapsing the two of those as if they were. Part of my work in the book is to kind of disentangle that and suggest that this is part of the ideological project of these groups, is to flatten those interests together and to separate the possibility of any kind of working class alliance between, say, environmentalists, indigenous groups, and workers, which would be a really amazing coalition to get together. And of course, probably one of the most frightening to the industry itself. And so keeping those separate is a really productive situation for them to nurture.
I was going to ask you sort of where do the workers sort of come into this entire narrative? Do we see them buying into these sort of narratives of, oh no, we're under attack? Or are they a little bit more ambivalent and critical of this, to your knowledge?
I would say, and so, yeah, it is just to my knowledge, because it isn't, I look more at the messaging and circulation rather than this kind of more sort of like the populist element of it, I guess you could say. But I do, after having spent so much time with it, I do have some inclinations. And that is that the workers generally do believe that they are under threat by protesters or those who support transition. Just transition, especially right now, is as it's kind of that language is entering into more sort of mainstream political discourse, is essentially becoming a scapegoat of a certain kind within those circles and being construed as a threat to livelihood and employment. To put yourself in the shoes of workers, it actually makes sense to understand it that way. The fossil economy is not particularly kind to the working class. The boom and bust cycle is not a sustainable one for sort of human economic life in a way, I think. And so when you have explanations for that suggest that this is because of, an environmentalist elite, that might be legible to you in that capacity. And it makes sense that you think that maybe you lost your job because of this, rather than you lost your job because your industry actually doesn't really care about you. This is sort of a bit of something I meditate on a little in the book, is kind of like oil itself gets mythologized as a source of wealth for the working class who work in oil and gas, not their own labor, despite the fact that it is their labor that's producing that wealth, and that their industry really doesn't have their back in that way. And so when you do get explanations for how that works, they can be seductive and tempting, I think. And that's not to suggest that they're gullible. I think that the narratives being circulated are powerful ones. There's a reason that these coalitions that I mentioned earlier aren't happening. And these kinds of suggestions that, let's say, those working for transition, just transition, don't care about development and don't care about people's livelihoods. It's a compelling narrative. It's one of the most important ones to challenge for us working in these fields. And I think even just transition as a qualified version of transition already started to do that. But as you can see, it's already then being undermined and sort of depoliticized in a way.
The way that I encountered the phrase just transition was this emphasis, like, this is on workers first. We're talking about a just transition that is inclusive of everybody and really sort of looks into all these economic issues that are being faced by the working class, and the way that we transition to a new, energy paradigm. It has to be dictated by the people, and it has to be good for the people as well. So it's so interesting to me to realize that over the past little while, this has been so politicized and sort of co-opted into that petroturfing narrative.
Yeah, it is. It's fascinating and it was very quick for that to happen, actually. I would assume it's when it started to enter actual kind of like, what's the word, like conventional political discourse, because the way we would have encountered it, like, and by we, I mean you and I quite literally, is through Just Powers and the research work we were doing at Alberta, which is a more academic environment, sort of encountering and developing these vocabularies. And then those types of vocabularies and frameworks then start to influence more policy level discussions. And I think once it got into the policy level is when it was latched onto by these groups. That's actually where my book ends, is discussing a meme produced by Olsan Strong that questions whether the just transition is an existential threat to Alberta. So this is kind of how the framing is being functioned and circulated. But
just reminiscent of Jason Kenney's War Room, right? To combat all these supposedly foreign environmentalist liberal threats to the sort of like existence of Canadian oil and gas, specifically Alberta oil and gas, but then also, I guess, Canadian political democracy, Canadian liberal democracy, kind of at that higher level.
Separate from the war room, but as part of his early efforts in office was the anti-Alberta energy campaign inquiry also, which you may recall, which was
I do.
a formal inquiry into the nature and character and quantity of foreign funding influencing environmentalist movements and organizations in Canada. And I think that went over not quite a year. Maybe the whole thing took a year, and there was like 8 months of the commissioned reports coming out and an interpretation of evidence and stuff by the commissioner. I read all of it. I read the commissioned reports and the final 600-page report. The conclusions by the end of it were sort of, yes, there's some foreign funding. No, it's not particularly excessive or unique to environmentalist organizations. It's kind of common for Canadian organizations to get funding from US partnerships and so on and so forth. And so it's really kind of like a drum up as if this is going to be a massive reveal. And then the conclusion is that it's not really that big of a deal. But I do think the whole process of doing the inquiry was the point. It wasn't really about what the results were going to be. It was to create this kind of fervor around the possibility of there being this kind of nefarious foreign acting in the environmentalist organizing. And the commissioned reports were really actually quite excessive in their claims as well. It was only the final commissioner who kind of lessened the claims and said there wasn't really enough evidence of what was being sort of accused in a certain capacity. That said, there's a set of recommendations at the end, and this is what's really important for me. And what I was looking at is, and one of the last recommendations is that there needs to be more resources put into branding Canadian oil better, basically. My read on that is that the inquiry then kind of creates conditions for policy to be geared towards funding even some of the groups that I'm looking at potentially in the future under that metric of recommendation that's been done in a formal capacity. We'll see how that plays out, but that seems to me to be the future of these kinds of things, is that they're going to be kind of somehow sort of state funded within Alberta, like the War Room itself, which is a version of that. It's a version of even some of the things that I'm looking at, if not a slightly more innocuous version to a certain degree, but it is certainly using the same kind of principles and motivations as what I've been calling petroturfing.
Okay, it seems like there's this narrative of being under attack, but then also this narrative relies upon there being a previous narrative of sort of a justified attack. And so they can rest in their victimhood.
Yeah, that would be one way of putting it, I think. And again, what's interesting to me is to look at the kind of material political economy level next to the discursive one. The discursive one up here is saying, we're under attack. Look, read the news. There's environmentalists everywhere who don't want oil anymore. The material political economic side is just rising up. More production, more production, more production. So this friction or sort of separated condition to me is actually what shows how much of an issue and how sort of maybe even problematic we might say the framing of kind of marginalization and threat even is in the first place. How can an industry be under threat that has the most lobbying power in Canada next to banks, is continually breaking production records, gets massive amounts of subsidies, got a pipeline bought out by supposedly the most environmentalist prime minister we've ever had, right? It just doesn't make sense until you see it as a kind of cultural project that's potentially planting seeds for a future condition that might be different. When we actually have a prime minister or leader or somebody that is seriously thinking about putting caps on production or, these kinds of hard measures, then those kind of cultural narratives can be tapped into to do a certain kind of work that could be pretty effective, I think. That's really the point of the book. I'm actually pretty tired of looking at this stuff, as you might imagine.
Yeah.
The point of the book is to start this conversation and have a kind of archive and mapping of what has happened over the past decade as a resource for what is going to happen next. because I'll probably be kind of walking away from looking at this stuff for a bit and working more on. I have a historical project that I'm going to look at, which will be a bit easier on me.
Yeah, taking a bit of a break from all that. Yeah,
using similar kind of approaches and frameworks, but yeah, a historical project on the Mackenzie Valley pipeline, which was never built. And so there's this nice kind of, this happened, this didn't happen in this set period of time that I can look at.
Right.
There.
Alternate universe.
There won't be a convoy about it.
I think that your book is really important in that it sort of allows us to distance ourselves from these narratives and look at them critically as being narratives. I guess, to use a metaphor, taking the goldfish out of the pond and saying, look, there is the pond. Now, what are you going to do about the pond? Let's think critically about this pond now that you can actually see it.
I think that's a great metaphor, because one of the things that I think happens in this kind of right-wing project that I'm looking at is a certain kind of like decontextualization of types of knowledge and representation. And so you see feminism being deployed for supporting oil and gas, for example, in the case of that advertisement on the Oprah Winfrey network. And so what I'm kind of doing is sort of strategically recontextualizing some of these things into the actual kind of material and discursive environments that they're coming out of, for people who really aren't tapped into energy politics, that don't have this kind of academic background that you and I share in relation to kind of petrocultures and energy humanities, and so really important and useful approaches that you really can't expect people to have at their disposal. I think that's one of the benefits that we can share as academics, is that we actually have gotten time and resources to some degree and varying degrees to pursue topics that aren't necessarily like profitable enterprises or anything like that. We can actually spend time with this material and communicate results and sort of important insights this way. And so I hope the book does that. I think you show these sorts of things I look at to people, and they're sort of brushed off as kind of inconsequential and silly, right, or they're taken seriously but not really understood in the larger environment in which they're operating out of. So there's a handful of responses that can come out of that. And I've been told that it's a public service of some sort. It's hard to tell, like 10 years into looking at this stuff, but yeah. So
I think it's valuable.
It's like tracking this and spending time with this really toxic stuff, so other people don't have to as much or something.
Yeah, I think it's really valuable to show the context in which this is happening, right? It's not like, well, no, these aren't isolated incidents, but part of a larger confluence of these narratives that have been going on for so many different years and are now influencing so many different projects and sectors of society in these certain ways, so that we're all thinking certain ways. I mean, I will watch on YouTube these sort of green solutions in Canada and, Environment Canada and, I don't know, like living in tiny houses off grid, that kind of stuff, right? And I'm just looking to turn my brain off and maybe look at some like hopeful narratives of alternatives. And the ad that I am served is on behalf of the Alberta Oil and Gas, or Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, showing me these lovely green vistas of reclaimed, woodlands, and saying that, like Canadian oil, if you just look a little bit closer, you can see that it's really invested in all these like greener, cleaner futures. That ad has come up quite a few times now already. And I'm able to sort of look at it skeptically and say, I've never seen a place like that. I'm not really sure what it is trying to tell me. But if I wasn't able to sort of put it in that context, that larger context, I don't know if I would think about it quite so critically.
Those ads are interesting, especially talking about the reclamation projects, which I'd brought up earlier, in that they just haven't really sorted out the process for reclamation to scale in any capacity. And so the actual projects themselves that do look like the way that you saw in these ads, they're sort of themselves being used as a promotional device to rationalize further resource extraction than they are actually any sort of scalar solution to the absolute destruction that's happening there. It's kind of fascinating to me how that works in those areas. And I do think reclamation is probably going to be one of the most major points of contention, if it isn't already, in the near future, as we sort of get into the sort of end stages of some of the legacy projects. It's worth pointing out that in the oil sands, they didn't really start until the late 60s, 1967. And usually the projects run for, I think, between 40 and 60 years. And so we're only really now at the point where some of those earlier projects are at the end of their life cycle and reckoning with the kind of limits of reclamation technology today.
Right.
And that'll only then kind of continue into the future with projects that were started in the 80s and 90s and so on. So yeah, the temporality is really kind of hard to grapple with, I would say.
In Solarpunk, we're thinking about temporalities. We're thinking about these cleaner and greener futures, but it's more like, what do we do in the here and now that can help us sort of get there? So now that we have this knowledge and context for petroturfing and all these energy imaginary narratives that are sort of influencing us, is there anything that we can do about it? So it seems like it's just this huge and untouchable sort of industry. What sort of the ways that we as sort of like just regular people can engage with it?
There's kind of at least two kind of dynamics here. One is the sort of more cynical dimension of realizing the kind of like vast material impacts of this industry and its kind of momentum that is very hard to disrupt, considering those temporalities at work that I just mentioned. But part of it, I think, is nurturing different energy imaginaries. The book kind of ends with this sort of more speculative suggestion about thinking not so much in terms of this kind of reactionary dimension, whether it's thinking about dirty oil or ethical oil, and actually kind of moving beyond that kind of impasse that's produced by the two of those, to think about how we might change our own relationship to oil, not in the sense of just saying we're done with it and keep it in the ground, because even if we do that, we'll still be sort of haunted by the legacies of it, whether it's in the atmosphere or in pollution and in plastics and so on and so forth. And so I really draw on Zoe Todd's work, if you're familiar with that, and if listeners aren't, she has a great piece called Fish, Kin, and Hope that kind of talks about approaching fossil fuels as kin and identifying that the problem is really not with fossil fuels themselves as a kind of substance, but with the way that we interact with it. And in that, Zoe Todd's phrasing is that fossil fuels have been weaponized by industry in that sort of extracting and burning process that we see in industrial economies. It sounds like an idealist solution in the sense that changing the way we kind of think about and relate to oil sounds kind of up in the air and abstract, but there's actually a kind of material dimension to it too, in that it's sort of asking us to reevaluate how we engage with oil collectively in a certain way. Will that somehow create some kind of practical points for transitioning away from oil? I'm not so sure, but maybe there are other avenues of kind of making demands to, I would say then on the flip side, like helping to shape discourse in a certain way too. So there's this kind of material relationship, but also intervening when you can, when you see discussions about oil or fossil fuels getting into that zone of petroturfing, if you will. If you see this happening, name it as such, and don't really entertain it. I think this is the issue that's happening, not just in the stuff that I'm looking at, but I think in kind of like right-wing media spheres in general, which is this kind of constant push to debate and like have some kind of discussion, which the premises are already fraught. They're not done in good faith and so on and so forth. So not engaging in those situations, I think, is actually really important. Otherwise, it's essentially creating fodder of a certain sort for those positions. One of the groups that in the US that I look at that's ran by a guy named Alex Epstein, he has formats to follow that he suggests and adopts himself in how to convince people of your positioning and these sorts of things, like really structural debate tactics to kind of like strong arm people into into kind of accepting his positions in ways. And so I think it's worth not even having those debates in the first place, and recognizing when situations are productive to actually create the possibility for some kind of change, and when they're not. That's very valuable, I think. And also if people that are listening are activists, it's also like a mode of self-care to make sure you don't wear yourself out by constantly engaging in bad faith conversations. So those would be maybe like the three things I would suggest. The more kind of abstract, we need to kind of like reconfigure our relationship to fossil fuels in a way that isn't just entirely about keeping them in the ground, but maybe that is part of it. My read on that is that like something like the oil sands, that's somewhere we can keep it in the ground. We don't need to rely on the oil sands for making plastics and stuff like that we need for medicine and these kinds of things. And then second, calling out these kinds of like false narratives, I guess, and false premises of energy imaginaries. And third, not engaging in situations that aren't actually productive ones. And maybe also things like divestment and pushing for divestment and stuff like that. But that's like a whole separate conversation.
No, that third one, knowing when not to engage, that's definitely something I would like to take to heart. And you're right, it's an act of self-care, really, to know when the only way to win is not to play.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I would say that is something that I've learned looking at the material that I've been looking at over the last 10 years, and it's not productive.
Well, thanks so much for discussing all of this with me today, Jordan.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to Solarpunk Presents,
a podcast hosted and produced by Ariel Kroon and Christina De La Rocha.
The audio for this episode was recorded in part on the traditional territory of the neutral Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples.
And in Germany. The opening and closing music for this podcast is Water Cooler Gang by Monkey Warhol, available for use under the Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 International License.
If you like what we do and want to support the podcast,
join our Patreon at www.patreon.com/solarpunkpresents,
or share the podcast with friends, family, and people you know who might be interested in our guests and what we have to say. We'd also love it if you could write us a nice review on your podcatcher of choice, because every review bumps us higher in the algorithm's priority, so we can reach more listeners.
Until the next episode,
keep dreaming and keep up the good work.